Welcome to this video, which summarizes the preliminary results of our search at the former site of the Shubenacadie Residential School. Before describing these results, we'll review our research methods to give a better understanding of how we arrived at our interpretations. I'll emphasize that this is a preliminary report at the conclusion of our first phase of research. At the community's request, we are ready, able, and certainly willing to continue the search and to further clarify our findings. For those who may not have the time to watch the full video, here's the conclusion. Our research to date has detected evidence of unmarked graves on the property, but these burials likely predate the foundation of the residential school by 100 years. Therefore, they're not directly associated with the residential school or its students. This project employs some of the most powerful landscape-scale archaeological research methods and technologies available, and is based on a solid foundation of historical research. We think the Shubenacadie research design can be a model for other searches at residential school sites across the country. Our goal from the beginning was not just to conduct a search with the best tools, but to reconstruct the historical environment, mapping the residential school complex, including local landforms, field boundaries, buildings, and other infrastructure spanning the site's history. Inventorying the property's archaeological features in this way allows a targeted search to be conducted in a meaningful context. We used the following methods. Historical maps dating from the 18th century to modern times, including these survey plans of the property, drawn in 1927, when the federal government purchased the land for the residential school from George and Minnie Gay. Sources like this reveal the scale of the original residential school property, over 147 acres, or 59.5 hectares. Early survey plans also allow us to plot pre-existing buildings on the site, including the house of George and Minnie Gay, seen here. Historical aerial photos and satellite images dating from the 1930s to the present day. This image was taken in 1938 and shows the early residential school in its landscape context, including the main school building, barn complex, and staff residences. These images enable us to track the site's evolution over the decades and better understand the relationship between site features, cultural memory, and other historical evidence. Lidar, or light detection and ranging, uses lasers mounted in aircraft to produce very detailed digital maps of the Earth's surface. We have access to Lidar via the province of Nova Scotia's Open Data Portal. Each pixel in this LiDAR map represents 20 centimeters on the ground, offering much sharper focus than traditional maps. More importantly, we can process the LiDAR data to digitally remove trees and other vegetation. Digital models of the bare surface can reveal areas where the Earth has been disturbed by human activity. Drone imagery. To further enhance our aerial view of the site, we captured our own imagery along 70 kilometers of flight lines with a Wingtra 1 fixed-wing drone, capturing over 30 gigabytes of photographic data. The resulting point cloud, consisting of over 900 million data points, has allowed us to create the most detailed and accurate map of this landscape ever made. Each pixel represents about 2.5 centimeters on the ground, an order of magnitude better than even the LiDAR, and generate an extraordinarily detailed 3D landscape model. On the ground, we walked over 79 kilometers of electromagnetic induction surveys. 772 survey lines covering 12.4 hectares, or 30.6 acres. These surveys use the EM38B and EM38 Mark II, instruments that measure the ground's ability to be magnetized and conduct an electric current. They can detect buried ditches, field boundaries, pipes and cables, the remains of buildings, and a range of subtler features. We've mapped the remains of the old residential school's buildings principally with this method. With the site's history, topography, and architecture better recorded, we have applied ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface environment in even greater detail. GPR works by transmitting radio wave energy into the ground and measuring reflections caused when the waves encounter different materials. We collect this data by plotting survey grids and walking the instrument back and forth along tightly spaced lines about 25 centimeters apart. We have surveyed 1,187 GPR lines in 12 grids, totaling over 28 kilometers. GPR has been used at many other residential school sites across the country, and our team has successfully employed GPR both here and internationally to study a range of buried features. In Nova Scotia, for example, we've mapped nearly 300 unmarked graves at Grand Pré National Historic Site of Canada. Consultants hired to conduct searches at the Shubenacadie residential school site in 2019 and 2020 also used GPR. Our work significantly expands on their effort, adds a range of other technologies, and includes more thorough historical research. The Mi'kmaq have lived in the Shubenacadie River Valley from time immemorial, and their history is recorded in cultural memory, place names, written texts, maps, and archaeological sites. The federal officials and politicians who inserted the residential school into this landscape in the late 1920s were not concerned with this history, and most of what has been written about the Shubenacadie residential school is also disconnected from the broader history of the landscape. Several aspects of that history are important for our search and require mention here. The site of the only residential school in the Maritime Provinces had long been a place of importance to the Mi'kmaq. By the early 18th century, French sources record the presence of a substantial Mi'kmaq village on the Shubenacadie River. Governor de Briand visited it in 1701, described the inhabitants as Christians, and observed that they grew a substantial amount of maize. The missionary priest Louis-Pierre Thury advocated supporting this settlement with funds from the French crown, but his premature death in 1699 prevented this from happening. The community is recorded several times subsequently by French priests, and by 1722, the French had built a mission here. The church, dedicated to Saint Anne, was located about 1 kilometer downriver from the future site of the residential school. Twice annually, on All Saints' Day and Pentecost, hundreds of Catholic Mi'kmaq from across the region gathered at Mission Saint Anne. Historian Geoffrey Plank emphasizes the mission's political importance, and this is a quote. Acadians, French travelers from Ile Royale, and representatives of Algonquian nations from the region north of the Bay of Fundy also attended religious ceremonies at Gowland's Chapel on the Shubenacadie, and so the mission helped to strengthen the links that tied various Catholic peoples of the maritime region together. The mission served as a communication center where Mi'kmaq leaders, missionaries, and others shared news and messages. Indeed, during the Anglo-Mi'kmaq War of 1722-26, the mission had been used as a meeting place where leaders of the Wabanaki Confederacy had coordinated their attacks. Members of this community, under the leadership of Jean-Baptiste Cope, negotiated the 1752 Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the British Crown. So the Shubenacadie Residential School was a central place, as we've observed, the only institution of its kind in the Maritime Provinces, but the landscape in which it was built had long been a central place in Mi'kmaq history. Following the 1755 deportation of the Acadians and the 7 Years' War, France surrendered its territorial claims to Nova Scotia to the British. Mission Saint Anne fell into ruin. The British government in Halifax immediately began issuing land grants in the Shubenacadie River Valley, giving the land around the mission in 1763 to Colonel Frederick Hamilton. He never lived here, and toward the end of the century, his 1,900-acre grant was purchased by James Ellis, an Irish immigrant. Ellis constructed a grist mill and a sawmill on the property, the sawmill on the creek draining the marsh just south of the residential school site. The Ellis descendants experienced financial difficulty and lost the property in 1834. In 1836, it was purchased by Daniel Snyde of Windsor, Nova Scotia. Snyde's Lake, north of the residential school site, is named after this family, who farmed here until the 1960s. Daniel Snyde divided the property among his sons, and one of them, Charles Snyde, took the southern part. The land purchased by the federal government for the residential school in 1927 was formerly Charles Snyde's farm. Land records indicate that the house owned by George and Minnie Gay in the 1920s, which we've seen before, formerly belonged to Charles Snyde. This is an important fact, as we'll see. None of the published memoirs or histories of the Shubenacadie Residential School refer to a formal cemetery at the school. This is perhaps not surprising, given that the Shubenacadie School, unlike many of the older residential schools in Western Canada, was established at a time of decreasing mortality among residential school students. Nevertheless, the memory of graves on the Shubenacadie Residential School grounds is long-lived. Isabel Knockwood, in her well-known memoir, Out of the Depths, reports that some community members suggested the school was cursed because it was built, quote, on a site which had long been of cultural significance to the Mi'kmaq, or on a former Mi'kmaq burial ground. In Indian School Road, author Chris Benjamin goes further, stating that the school was, quote, in fact, built over a sacred Mi'kmaq burial ground. But no source is provided. Archival evidence confirms the presence of a Mi'kmaq cemetery near the old mission site, but this is almost a kilometer from the residential school. And yet, stories of burials on the school property persist to the present. For instance, Peter Robinson, who worked as the school's groundskeeper for many years and lived in the house nearest the school, quote, expressed that there was a burial ground on the property. And this notion is echoed by other informants. Locally, there is a tradition of a small unmarked cemetery on the hillside near the main driveway leading to the front of the former school site. In a 2013 post on the Shubenacadie Residential School Survivors Facebook page, Isabel Knockwood refers to an unmarked grave here, quote, on the boys' side in the front of the school. Elsewhere, she recalls, quote, the old grave that was there when they built the school in 1924, where they dug up some ancestors' bones, and Father Mackey reburied them in the back on the girls' side. The reburial site may be the grave referenced in another of Isabel Knockwood's comments as having been located, quote, behind the clothesline on the girls' side, which was, by 2013, quote, all covered with cement. Another community member whose father attended the Shubenacadie Residential School around 1938 recalls him speaking of an old apple orchard on the school grounds. He remembered seeing graves just beyond the orchard. Accounts of graves on the property are too many to dismiss. They are also patterned, consistently pointing to the slope near the driveway at the front of the school. This traditional knowledge partly explains why consultants were hired to search this area with GPR in 2019 and again in 2020. Our geophysical surveys have mapped much of the infrastructure associated with the Shubenacadie Residential School, including the barn complex to the north of the main school building. The locations of several of the school's other buildings have also been mapped, as has some of the school's buried infrastructure, like the pipe that drew water from Snides Lake up to the main school building. To date, our search has not detected evidence of burials associated with the residential school. However, our research suggests there is a small cemetery just where tradition says it is located, on the slope, on the boys' side of the school, near the old driveway. We do not think this cemetery is associated with the residential school for two reasons. First, there is no record of a residential school cemetery here or anywhere else on the property, and it is highly unlikely that the school could have operated a cemetery in such a visible location at the front of the building next to the access road and main driveway, without it being noticed by students, neighbors, or visitors. For the same reasons, this location is unlikely to have been used for clandestine burials. Second, there is historical evidence of an older cemetery at this location. According to a 19th century source, James and Sarah Ellis, the Irish immigrants who lived here in the late 1700s, quote, are buried on Indian Hill, below where Charles Snide long lived. We've already mentioned that Charles Snide's farm eventually passed to George and Minnie Gay, and was the property purchased by the federal government as the setting for the Shubenacadie residential school. Our magnetic surveys have located Charles Snide's house at the top of the gravel driveway leading to the modern plastics plant, just above the area in question. A 1927 survey plan and 1930s aerial photographs show an orchard on the slope to the south, below the boys' wing of the residential school, where the school's main driveway was built. Our GPR surveys in this area have detected subsurface features resembling two graves. They exhibit high-amplitude reflections, measuring approximately 1.9 meters in length, 0.5 meters in width, and are buried approximately 70 centimeters below the surface. Other members of the Ellis family may have been buried here as well, and it is possible that graves were disturbed during the construction of the main driveway leading to the front of the residential school, giving rise to stories about the old burying ground and the residential school curse. If so, Father Mackey may have reburied members of the Ellis family rather than ancestral remains behind the girls' wing of the school. In Phase 1 of our investigation, we conducted a multi-instrument survey, archaeological inventory, and initial search of the Shubenacadie residential school site. Our goal was to respond quickly to community members' concerns with the best modern tools and thorough historical research. We've discovered that substantial portions of the residential school complex are preserved below ground. These have been recorded and may provide a basis for ongoing study, commemoration, and investigation. Our preliminary results suggest that members of the Ellis family are likely buried on the slope, south of the residential school site, and that at least some of the traditions about burials on the property may be linked to this unmarked cemetery. Construction of the driveway leading to the front of the residential school may have impacted one or more burials, further influencing cultural memory. Our GPR surveys have identified 2 possible graves here, and there may be others nearby, in areas currently obscured by vegetation or other barriers. These preliminary results do not conclude the search. We remain willing and able to continue at the community's direction if new information identifies additional sites of investigative potential.